My mom worshipped my brother and treated me like a curse, so I fought back, and her life fell apart. And then, growing up, I learned one thing early on. If something went wrong, I was going to get blamed for it. It didn't matter what it was. If the wrong kind of milk was in the fridge, if a bill was overdue, if my younger brother Jason got a bad grade in school, my mom would find a way to pin it on me. And it never stopped. I was the reason for the family's problems, no matter how unrelated I was to whatever mess was happening. At 28, I should have been used to it, but I wasn't. That night was no different. I was in the kitchen after work, exhausted, staring at the stack of bills on the table. My job barely covered my own expenses, but I still tried to help out when I could. Jason, my 24-year-old brother, never had to worry about things like that. He was the golden child, the perfect one, the one who could do no wrong in my mom's eyes. My mother, Deborah, walked in, sighing dramatically like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. That usually meant she was about to start something. "Karen," she said, voice sharp, "why do you keep buying this garbage cereal? You know Jason doesn't eat this kind." I glanced at the box on the counter. It was the same brand we always got, but apparently, this week, it wasn't good enough. "It's what was on sale," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'm trying to save money." Deborah scoffed and shook her head. "Oh, of course. Because you think saving a few dollars is more important than making sure your brother has what he likes." I clenched my jaw. It wasn't worth arguing. It never was. "By the way," she continued, grabbing a glass from the cupboard, "he's been really stressed about that job interview. I don't know why you had to put all those ideas in his head, making him nervous." I blinked. I was helping him prepare. He asked me for advice. "And you probably overwhelmed him," she shot back. "You always have to stick your nose in things. You don't think before you speak, and now look. He didn't get the job." My stomach twisted. Jason had told me himself that he thought the interview had gone well, but I knew my mom wouldn't care about that. It was easier to blame me than to accept that maybe he just wasn't the right fit. "Maybe it just wasn't meant to be," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Deborah gave me a cold smile. "Right. Because nothing ever has anything to do with you, does it?" I didn't answer. I had spent my entire life fighting this battle, arguing, trying to defend myself, trying to get her to see reason. But the truth was, she didn't want to see reason. If she couldn't blame me, she'd have to take responsibility for something, and that just wasn't in her nature. Instead of arguing, I got up, grabbed my coat, and walked out. Outside, the air was cold against my skin. The Chicago streets were quieter at this hour, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing. This wasn't just a bad day. This was my entire life. I thought back to when I was 12, when my parents divorced. Even then, my mom had made sure everyone knew I was the difficult one, the one who made things harder. She'd tell relatives that my attitude stressed my father out, that I was the reason things fell apart. Never mind the screaming matches between her and my dad. Never mind the fact that I was a kid, just trying to understand why my family was breaking in half. Nothing had changed since then, and suddenly, standing there on that cold sidewalk, I knew something had to. This wasn't just about one fight or one moment. This was a pattern, and patterns could be broken. I went back inside, my mind racing. I didn't say another word to my mom. I just went to my room, shut the door, and pulled out a notebook. I started writing. Every time she twisted a situation to make me look bad. Every time she blamed me for something I had nothing to do with. Every time she rewrote history to make herself the victim. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing for sure. This time, I wasn't going to let her keep getting away with it. Not anymore. I spent the next few weeks keeping track of everything. Every twisted truth, every misplaced blame, every moment my mother tried to rewrite reality. But I knew that my word alone wouldn't be enough. Jason had spent his entire life believing everything she said. My relatives either ignored it or were too used to her behavior to question it. If I was going to break this cycle, I needed more than just memories. I needed proof. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, my dad, Richard, called and asked if I could help him sort through some old paperwork. He had recently downsized to a smaller place and was finally getting rid of years of clutter. I agreed, mostly because I missed spending time with him. When I got to his apartment, he had already pulled out several dusty boxes filled with old tax records, medical bills, and random paperwork. We spent an hour sifting through them, tossing out what he no longer needed. That's when I found it, a thick folder labeled Education Fund. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were records of deposits, withdrawals, and payments made toward Jason's college expenses. It should have been simple. Money goes in, tuition gets paid, but something felt off. I flipped through the pages, and the more I read, the deeper the pit in my stomach grew. The deposits were almost entirely from my dad. My mother had barely contributed. But the withdrawals, they were huge. Way more than what Jason's tuition should have cost. I showed the folder to my dad, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do these numbers look right to you?" I asked. Richard frowned, taking the folder from me. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the pages, his face growing more tense with each line he read. This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Your mom was handling the payments. I trusted her." I pointed to a series of large withdrawals, none of which matched Jason's school fees. "Jason said his tuition was covered," I said. "But this is thousands more than it should be. And look at these transactions. A $5,000 withdrawal right before a vacation? Another one a week before she put a down payment on that new car?" Richard rubbed his temple, looking suddenly exhausted. "You think she used the money for herself?" he asked, but I could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer. I didn't need to say it. The numbers spoke for themselves. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jason, how much he idolized our mother, how much he trusted her. I needed to talk to him, but I had to be careful. If I came at him too hard, he'd shut down and defend her like he always did. The next day, I called him and asked if we could meet up. He agreed, though I could tell he was distracted when we sat down at the cafe. "Mom's been on edge lately," he said as he stirred his coffee. "She thinks you're trying to cause drama again." I almost laughed. Of course she did. "I just have a question," I said, keeping my tone light. "How much did your tuition actually cost? Like, ballpark?" Jason raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Just curious." He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe 25,000 a year? But I had some scholarships, so it wasn't even that much." I nodded, pretending to think. "And Mom handled all the payments?" "Yeah, she took care of everything. She always made sure I was set." I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled to a picture I had taken of the folder. I turned the screen toward him. "Then how do you explain this?" Jason squinted at the numbers. At first, he just looked confused, but as he kept reading, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Wait, these withdrawals." His voice trailed off. He looked up at me, something breaking in his eyes. "This isn't all for my tuition." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." For the first time in our lives, Jason didn't immediately jump to Mom's defense. He didn't tell me I was overreacting or imagining things. He just sat there, staring at the proof in front of him. "I need to talk to Dad," he finally said. "I already did," I admitted. "We both saw the numbers, Jason. She lied to all of us." Jason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "She always said she was doing everything for me." "She said a lot of things," I replied. "But the truth? The truth is right here." I knew that look on his face. He wasn't ready to accept it yet, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That was enough for now. That night, my dad called. "I think it's time we confront her," he said. I exhaled. "Yeah, it's time." We agreed to bring it up at the next family dinner. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The night of the family dinner, I felt like I was walking into a battlefield. The gathering was at my Aunt Michelle's house, and while it was supposed to be a casual get-together, nothing was ever casual when my mom was involved. I arrived a little late, which was intentional. I wanted to see the mood of the room before I walked into whatever mess she had planned. From the second I stepped inside, I could feel the tension. My mom, Deborah, was already making her rounds, acting like the perfect host, even though it wasn't her house. She was laughing too loudly, making sure everyone knew how much effort she had put into helping with the evening. Jason was there too, sitting stiffly on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up when he saw me, giving a small nod. He hadn't said much since I showed him the financial records, but I knew he was still processing everything. I hadn't even made it to the kitchen when I heard my mom's voice carry over the chatter. "It's such a shame Michelle isn't here tonight," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. But honestly, I can't blame her. After everything with Karen, I'm sure she just didn't want to deal with the drama. I stopped in my tracks. I should have known she'd try something like this. People started shifting uncomfortably. My cousin Rachel shot me a glance, her lips pressed into a thin line. My Uncle Dan suddenly became very interested in his drink. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen where a small group of family members had gathered. My mom zeroed in on me immediately, her expression already smug. "Oh, speak of the devil," she said sweetly. "Karen, honey, we were just talking about how your aunt decided to skip tonight. I was just telling everyone that maybe your attitude at the last family event had something to do with it." I met her gaze steadily. "Aunt Michelle told me she wasn't feeling well," I said calmly. "She RSVP'd earlier in the week and said she wasn't sure she'd make it." Deborah waved a dismissive hand. "Well, she didn't say it was because of you, but let's be honest. Your energy hasn't exactly been the most welcoming lately." There it was. That subtle dig, that twisting of the truth. It was always the same game with her. Jason shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "Has anyone else talked to Aunt Michelle?" I asked, looking around the room. Silence. My mom's smugness flickered for half a second. Then Rachel, who had been quietly sipping her drink in the corner, cleared her throat. "I actually spoke to her a couple of days ago," Rachel said. "She told me she wasn't coming because she's been feeling sick. That's all." The air in the room changed. Deborah's smile froze in place, her mind scrambling for a way to spin this. "Well," she said after a moment, "maybe that was part of it. But we all know how sensitive Michelle is. She doesn't like conflict, and with Karen always stirring things up." "Mom," Jason interrupted suddenly. "Just stop." A hush fell over the room. Jason never contradicted her, especially not in public. Deborah turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. Jason set his phone down and finally looked at her. "It means stop blaming Karen for everything. You do this all the time." For a second, I thought she might actually be speechless. But then she recovered, letting out a dry laugh. "Oh, honey, you don't see what's really happening here. She's been turning you against me, hasn't she?" Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "No, Mom. I just started paying attention." That hit her harder than anything else. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Rachel spoke up again. "Honestly, it's exhausting," Rachel muttered. "Every time something goes wrong, it's always Karen's fault. It's like a reflex for you." Deborah's eyes narrowed. "Oh, so now you're all ganging up on me?" Nobody answered. That silence, the hesitation from the family, was all she needed to see. I watched as the realization sank in. She wasn't winning this time. She scoffed and crossed her arms. "Fine. If you all want to turn against me, go ahead. But don't come running back when she stirs up more drama. Because trust me, it's only a matter of time." She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the kitchen, disappearing down the hallway. A door slammed a moment later. Nobody said a word. I felt Jason looking at me. When I finally met his gaze, something was different. There was no resentment, no anger, just something close to regret. I didn't see it before, he said quietly. I do now. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. A week after the dinner party, my dad called and told me he was ready. We're doing this at my place, Richard said over the phone. I don't want her causing a scene in front of the whole family again, but Jason needs to be there. He needs to hear the truth from both of us. I agreed. Jason was still caught between two versions of reality, the one our mom had built for him and the one he was just starting to see. If we were going to break through, we needed to do it carefully. That Saturday afternoon, Jason and I arrived at our dad's house. He had everything laid out, the documents, the transaction records, and a few pages he had printed with notes about the withdrawals. He was serious about this. He wanted everything to be undeniable. Deborah showed up 20 minutes late. Acting like this was just another minor inconvenience in her day. She walked in with her usual air of confidence, glancing around as if she was expecting a party. When she saw the papers on the table, her smile faded just a little. "What's this?" she asked, taking off her coat and draping it over a chair. Richard didn't waste time. "It's about the education fund, Deborah. We need to talk about where all that money went." She let out a dramatic sigh, already rolling her eyes. "Oh, for God's sake, Richard. Jason's college was taken care of. Why are we dragging this up now?" I watched Jason's face. He was stiff, his hands clasped together on his lap. He wasn't looking at her. That was a good sign. Richard slid the records across the table. "Because the numbers don't add up," he said. "I looked through every withdrawal. What you took out doesn't match Jason's tuition or expenses. Not even close." She barely glanced at the papers. "This is ridiculous." Jason finally spoke. "Mom, just look." That got her attention. Her eyes flicked to him, as if she was trying to read how much trouble she was actually in. She slowly picked up the papers and scanned them. Her face remained neutral at first, but then she saw the specific transactions: $5,000 before a trip to Florida, another large withdrawal before she put a down payment on her car, multiple smaller ones that had nothing to do with Jason's school. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. "This is out of context." Jason leaned forward. "Then explain it." Her jaw tightened. "There were expenses you don't understand. Unexpected costs. I covered things you never knew about." Richard crossed his arms. "Like what, Deborah?" "Because Jason and I already went through his actual college costs, and they don't match." She set the papers down with a sharp exhale. "Oh, please. You think I was just pocketing money for fun? You think I was out there blowing cash while raising two kids?" I finally spoke. "That's exactly what you were doing." Her head snapped toward me, her expression turning cold. "And of course, you'd love to play the victim in this, wouldn't you?" "I'm not the victim here," I said calmly. "Jason is. You took money that was meant for his education and spent it on yourself. That's just a fact." Jason exhaled through his nose, staring at the table. "Mom, did you even use any of this for me?" Deborah hesitated for a second too long. That was all it took. Jason pushed his chair back, standing up so fast it scraped against the floor. "I trusted you," he muttered. "You told me everything was fine. You always made me feel like I owed you for all the sacrifices you made, and the whole time, you were lying to me." Deborah stood up too, defensive. "I did sacrifice for you," she snapped. "You have no idea how hard it was to keep everything together. I had to make choices." "You had a choice," Jason cut in. His voice was shaking, but not with sadness, with anger. "And you chose yourself." She blinked at him, stunned silent for the first time. I could tell she wasn't used to him talking back like this. Richard, sensing an opening, leaned forward. "You need to pay back what you took," he said. "We're not letting this slide, Deborah." She let out a dry laugh. "You're not serious." Jason turned to her, his hands still shaking. If you care about me at all, you'll make this right. The room was thick with silence. For the first time, my mom looked uncertain. Then, instead of taking responsibility, she turned her glare back to me. This is all because of you. I didn't flinch. You've been poisoning Jason against me, whispering in his ear, turning him against his own mother. You've always been jealous, Karen. Ever since you were a kid, you couldn't stand when things didn't revolve around you. Jason let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Are you kidding me? He asked. I didn't even listen to Karen for most of my life. I believed you, and you lied. She looked back and forth between us, realizing she had lost control. The more she spoke, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. Deborah, Richard said, voice firm. If you don't start taking responsibility, we will take legal action. That got her attention. Her face darkened. You'd really do that to me? After everything I've done for this family? You didn't do it for this family, I said. You did it for yourself. Deborah stared at us, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists. Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house. The front door slammed behind her. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Jason let out a breath and sat back down, his whole body tense. She's never going to admit it, is she? He muttered. No, I said. She won't. Richard exhaled and ran a hand over his face. We'll move forward with the legal process, he said. She's not getting away with this. Jason nodded slowly. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said after a long pause. For everything. I swallowed. We were raised to believe she was always right. It's not your fault. Jason looked at me, really looked at me, and nodded. For the first time in years, we were on the same side. After my mom stormed out of my dad's house, I knew she wasn't going to stay quiet for long. Sure enough, within days, she started making calls, twisting the story to anyone who would listen. At first, I started noticing the change in how some family members spoke to me. Short, clipped messages, sudden coldness from relatives who had been neutral before. Then came the actual accusations. My Aunt Laura called me, her voice full of forced concern. Karen, your mom told me everything. She said you and your dad ambushed her, accused her of stealing, and threatened to sue. You know how much she's been through. Do you really want to destroy your own mother? Destroy her? I almost laughed. Laura, do you want to see the bank statements? I asked, my voice even. Because I can send them to you right now. No twisting, no stories. Just numbers. They don't lie. She hesitated. That was all I needed to hear. She said you've been making things up, Laura mumbled. Then why won't she prove it? If I'm lying, she should have no problem showing where the money went. Silence. Then Laura sighed. Send me what you have. I did. That was the beginning of the shift. One by one, my mother's carefully built army started falling apart. Relatives who had blindly believed her began reaching out to me, quietly asking for the truth. I gave them the facts, nothing more. And as the truth spread, so did the anger. It turned out I wasn't the only one she had taken advantage of. My cousin Rachel called me one evening, her voice tight with frustration. You know she borrowed money from me years ago? Said it was for an emergency. I found out later she spent it on some fancy hotel stay. Never paid me back. My Uncle Dan had a similar story. She asked me for cash after the divorce, swore it was to help with Jason's school. Now I wonder if I ever saw a dime go toward that. With every call, with every confession, her grip on the family weakened. Jason, for his part, was quieter about it. He wasn't reaching out to people or defending himself publicly, but I could tell something had shifted in him. A week after the confrontation, he texted me out of nowhere. Want to grab coffee? I stared at the message for a long moment, then replied. Sure. We met at a small cafe near his apartment. For the first few minutes, Neither of us said much. It was still new, this version of us where we weren't on opposite sides. Finally, Jason spoke. "She called me last night," he said. "Told me I betrayed her." I nodded. "Figures." I told her she needed to take responsibility. She started crying, saying she gave up everything for us, that she had no choice. I took a sip of my coffee. And Jason let out a slow breath. For the first time, I didn't believe her. That was the moment I knew he was really free. After that, things started changing faster than I expected. My dad moved forward with the legal action, forcing my mom to return as much of the stolen money as possible. She fought it, of course, claimed she was being targeted, that we were cruel and ungrateful. But in the end, she had no defense. The numbers were too clear, the evidence too strong. She had to pay back what she could. But the real consequence wasn't the money. It was the isolation. By the time the truth had fully spread, most of the family had distanced themselves from her. She tried to reach out to the ones who still spoke to her, spinning new stories, finding new ways to be the victim. But the problem with burning bridges is that eventually, you run out of places to go. Jason, for the first time in his life, started setting real boundaries. He stopped answering her dramatic late-night calls. He didn't rush to her defense when she played the victim. And for the first time, he started making an effort with me. It was small at first, coffee here and there, a text just to check in. Then, one night, he invited me over for a game night with some of his friends. I almost said no. The idea of casually hanging out with him, after everything, felt strange. But then I realized I wanted to go. And when I did, it wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was just easy. That was how I knew we were really moving forward. As for the rest of the family, things changed in ways I never expected. Without my mom constantly stirring the pot, gatherings were more relaxed. People laughed more, stayed longer. It was like a weight had lifted from everyone. One night, at a birthday party for one of our cousins, I looked around and realized something. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to be on guard. I wasn't waiting for the next attack. I was just there, part of the family. And my mom wasn't. She tried, of course. She showed up uninvited once, but my dad calmly told her she wasn't welcome unless she was willing to respect the boundaries we had set. She left in a huff, calling him a traitor on her way out. That was the last time she tried. I knew she would keep telling her version of the story to whoever would listen, that she'd keep painting herself as the victim, rewriting history to make herself look like the wounded hero. But I didn't care anymore, because the people who mattered, they knew the truth, and that was enough. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and I never would again.